sir, you need to wake up right now, and I mean, right now." The voice sliced through the dimmed cabin of the Boeing 787 like a knife through silk, sharp and loaded with authority that had no business being there at 11:30 on a Tuesday night when most reasonable people were either home in bed or at least on their way there, not standing in the first-class cabin of an airplane that hadn't even left the gate yet, looking down at a sleeping passenger like he was some kind of criminal who needed to be dealt with immediately and without mercy. The purple mood lighting that was supposed to create a relaxing atmosphere for premium passengers who had paid thousands of dollars for the privilege of sitting in these leather seats suddenly felt more like the lighting in an interrogation room, casting harsh shadows across the first-class cabin that should have been a sanctuary of comfort and luxury. A place where exhausted travelers could finally rest after long days of meetings and negotiations and all the other demands that come with the kind of life that involves frequent air travel and international business dealings. Outside the reinforced windows of JFK's Terminal 5, rain hammered against the glass with the kind of intensity that made travelers grateful to be inside rather than out there in the weather, turning the runway lights into streaks of red and white that blurred together like abstract art, creating patterns that would have been beautiful if anyone had been in the mood to appreciate them instead of dealing with whatever crisis was unfolding in Seat 3A. The terminal itself had been nearly deserted when the late-night boarding began with the usual chaos of daytime travel, replaced by the quiet efficiency of the graveyard shift when gate agents moved with the practiced weariness of people who had seen everything multiple times and weren't surprised by anything anymore, just tired and ready for their shifts to end so they could go home to their own beds and their own lives. The gate agent who had processed the boarding passes for this flight had barely glanced at the passengers streaming past her station, her eyes heavy with the fatigue that comes from working the late shift, when your body is screaming that you should be asleep, waving people through with the kind of automatic efficiency that spoke of thousands of similar interactions over the years, each boarding pass getting the same quick scan and the same soft beep that meant everything was in order. No problems, no issues, no reason for anyone to be concerned about anything at all. The few passengers who had made their way onto the aircraft during the initial boarding period had settled into their seats with the quiet satisfaction that comes from knowing you've paid for comfort and service that most people can only dream about, adjusting the personal entertainment systems and requesting pre-departure beverages and generally behaving like people who understood that first class wasn't just about the seat itself, but about the entire experience of being treated like someone whose comfort and preferences actually mattered to the people responsible for getting them safely from one city to another. Damon Rivera didn't stir from his position in Seat 3, his body finally surrendering to the exhaustion that had been building for the better part of 48 hours. The kind of bone-deep tiredness that comes from pushing yourself beyond what any human being should reasonably be expected to endure, running on nothing but caffeine and adrenaline and sheer stubborn determination to get the job done, no matter what it cost you in terms of sleep or sanity or anything else that might normally be considered important. The noise-canceling earbuds he wore weren't just doing their job of blocking out the ambient sounds of the aircraft and the terminal beyond. They were performing miracles, creating a cocoon of blessed silence around a mind that had been running at full speed for longer than was healthy or sustainable, finally allowing him to shut down the constant stream of thoughts and concerns and calculations that had been dominating every waking moment for months on end. At 43 years old, Damon had the kind of presence that usually commanded attention the moment he walked into a room, the kind of physical and personal authority that came from standing 6 feet 3 inches tall with broad shoulders that spoke of someone who had worked his way up from nothing and wasn't about to let anyone forget the journey he'd taken to get where he was now. But tonight slumped in the buttery soft leather seat with his charcoal gray hoodie pulled low over his eyes, and his long legs stretched out in the spacious first-class suite that offered more room than most people had in their entire economy-class row. He looked like nothing more than another tired traveler trying to catch a few hours of sleep before facing whatever waited for him at his destination, whether that was meetings or family obligations, or just the simple pleasure of sleeping in his own bed for the first time in what felt like forever. The hoodie was soft and worn in that way that expensive suits and tailored shirts could never quite replicate the kind of comfortable clothing that became like a second skin after years of wear, paired with faded jeans that had seen better days but fit perfectly, and a pair of Jordan sneakers that had walked through more corporate boardrooms and high-powered offices than most CEOs would care to admit, because Damon had never been the kind of person who believed that clothing defined competence, or that you needed to wear a three-piece suit to prove you knew what you were doing in the business world. His only luggage was a battered leather messenger bag tucked securely in the overhead compartment containing nothing more than a laptop with enough computing power to run a small country. Some documents that represented months of legal work and negotiations, and the kind of exhaustion that comes from closing the biggest deal of your career while fighting jet lag and running on approximately 3 hours of sleep in as many days, each of those hours interrupted by phone calls or sudden bursts of inspiration or anxiety about details that needed to be checked one more time before the final signatures could be applied to the pages that would change everything. Sitting beside him in seat 3, Bee pressed against the window with a soft airplane blanket wrapped around her small frame. 9-year-old Lyra Rivera slept peacefully with her stuffed elephant clutched under one arm, her breathing deep and even in the way that only children can manage, completely unbothered by the travel and the late hour, and all the adult concerns that might have kept someone older awake despite their exhaustion. Her father had made sure she was comfortable before allowing himself to finally close his own eyes, tucking the blanket around her and making sure her favorite toy was within reach. The small acts of parental care that had become second nature over the years of raising her mostly on his own after her mother's death when Lyra was just 4 years old. The acquisition papers were signed, sealed, and delivered sitting in a secure server somewhere in London, where teams of lawyers were probably still dotting I's and crossing T's on the most complex business transaction Damon had ever been involved in, making sure that every possible contingency was covered and every potential problem was addressed before anyone could raise objections or try to back out of the agreement that had taken 18 months of intense negotiation to finally bring to completion. Meridian Airways was his, now all of it, from the gleaming aircraft sitting at gates around the world to the thousands of employees who had no idea their lives had just changed in ways they couldn't possibly imagine yet, from the mechanics who kept the planes flying safely to the flight attendants who served drinks and smiled at passengers to the executives who made decisions about routes and pricing and all the other details that went into running a major airline in the modern world. The deal had been 18 months in the making, with due diligence periods that felt like they lasted forever, and negotiations that had pushed everyone involved to their absolute limits, testing patience and creativity, and the ability to find compromises that satisfied multiple parties with competing interests and different visions for what the airline should become under new ownership. But it was done now, finished, complete. And all Damon wanted was to get home to his apartment in Chicago, pour himself 3 fingers of good whiskey that he'd been saving for exactly this kind of occasion, and sleep for approximately 16 hours straight without anyone calling him or emailing him or asking him to make one more decision about anything at all. The boarding pass in his pocket printed on thick, gold-embossed cardstock that marked him as one of Meridian Airways' most elite frequent flyers, despite the fact that he hadn't actually been a frequent flyer until he started making regular trips to negotiate the purchase of the airline itself. Showed seat 3A, the premium suite that he had booked exactly 3 hours ago when it became clear that the final signatures were going to happen today instead of tomorrow as originally scheduled, requiring him to catch this late-night flight instead of the morning departure he had originally planned to take. Chelsea Bradford stood in the galley entrance like a storm cloud gathering strength before unleashing its fury on unsuspecting victims below her navy blue Meridian Airways uniform pressed to geometric perfection with creases so sharp they could probably cut paper, and her platinum blonde hair pulled back in a French twist that hadn't moved even a millimeter despite the humidity and general chaos that came with a typical evening at one of the world's busiest airports. At 39 years old, she had been flying with Meridian Airways for 17 years, long enough to have developed very specific and deeply held ideas about who belonged in first class and who didn't. ideas that had been reinforced by years of compliments from satisfied passengers who appreciated her attention to detail, and commendations from supervisors who valued her commitment to maintaining the standards that separated premium service from the kind of experience that anyone could get if they were willing to sit in economy class with the masses. The silk scarf around her neck was tied with the kind of precision that spoke of someone who believed that small details mattered immensely, that the difference between excellence and mediocrity could be found in how perfectly a uniform was maintained and how consistently policies were enforced, even when those policies weren't actually written down anywhere, but existed only in the unspoken understanding of what first class should look and feel like for the passengers who paid premium prices for premium experiences. Her red lipstick was applied with surgical precision, creating a mouth that looked more like a weapon than a welcome, and her eyes held the kind of cold assessment that could make grown men squirm under her gaze, questioning whether they really belonged in the space they were occupying, or whether they should have stayed in whatever lesser accommodation was more appropriate for people like them. First class wasn't just a section of the aircraft to Chelsea. It was a sanctuary, a sacred space where senators and CEOs and celebrities could expect a level of service and atmosphere that justified the $7,200 they paid for the privilege of sitting in those leather seats, being served champagne in crystal glasses, and generally being treated like royalty for the duration of their flight. She had spent 17 years curating that atmosphere with the dedication of a museum curator, protecting priceless artifacts, protecting it from anything or anyone that might diminish the experience for passengers who paid premium prices and expected premium treatment in return, who didn't want to be reminded that the world beyond the first-class cabin was full of ordinary people with ordinary problems and ordinary budgets that didn't allow for the kind of luxury that first class represented. Standing beside her, looking increasingly nervous as she watched her supervisor's expression grow darker and more determined. Jasmine Chen hurried over when Chelsea snapped her fingers with the kind of imperious gesture that made it clear this wasn't a request but a command that needed to be followed immediately and without question. At 24 years old, Jasmine had been flying for exactly 9 months, long enough to understand the basic requirements of the job and to have developed some confidence in her ability to handle the routine tasks that came with being a flight attendant, but not nearly long enough to navigate the complex social hierarchies and unwritten rules that governed life at 35,000 feet, where seniority meant everything, and challenging someone who outranked you could have serious consequences for your career trajectory and your ability to get the good routes and the desirable shifts. Her movements were quick and nervous in the way that comes from being new to a job where making mistakes can have serious consequences from being watched and evaluated constantly by people who have been doing this work for years and have strong opinions about the right way to do everything from pouring coffee to dealing with difficult passengers to maintaining the kind of professional demeanor that the airline expected from everyone who wore the uniform, regardless of how long they'd been doing it or how comfortable they felt in the role they were trying to fill. "Did you check that man's boarding pass?" Chelsea asked, her voice dropping to the kind of harsh whisper that somehow managed to sound more threatening than if she had simply spoken at normal volume. The kind of tone that parents use when they're trying to discipline their children in public without making a scene, but still want to make absolutely clear that there will be consequences for whatever misbehavior has occurred. She gestured toward seat 3A with a manicured finger that had been painted the same deep red as her lipstick, her entire posture radiating the kind of disapproval that could make even confident people start questioning their own judgment and wondering whether they had somehow missed something obvious that everyone else could see clearly. Some violation of standards or expectations that should have been immediately apparent to anyone with eyes and a basic understanding of how the world worked. Jasmine looked confused, glancing toward Damon, and then back to Chelsea with the kind of expression that suggested she wasn't entirely sure what she was supposed to be seeing, or what problem her supervisor had identified that required this level of concern and intervention. "The gate agents checked them all," she said carefully, her voice carrying just a hint of the uncertainty that comes from dealing with a supervisor who seems upset about something that isn't immediately obvious to anyone else who might be observing the situation from the outside. "I was prepping the welcome champagne service like you asked me to do." Chelsea let out a sharp breath through her nose, the kind of sound that parents make when their children have failed to grasp something that should have been completely obvious to anyone with even the most basic level of intelligence or awareness. The kind of exasperated sigh that says, "I can't believe I have to explain this to you without actually using any of those words out loud where other people might hear them and judge the person making the sound." "Look at him," she said, her voice carrying the kind of certainty that brooked no disagreement or alternative interpretations. The kind of absolute conviction that comes from years of believing that your judgment is superior to everyone else's, and that your perspective on situations is the only one that really matters when decisions need to be made. Sweatshirt jeans, sneakers that look like they've been through a garbage disposal and came out worse for the experience. He looks like he just rolled out of a homeless shelter and wandered onto the aircraft by mistake, thinking maybe he could get away with sitting in first class if nobody bothered to check his credentials or question his right to be there. Maybe he used miles to upgrade, Jasmine suggested tentatively, her voice getting smaller with each word as she recognized that her supervisor was building up to something that was going to be unpleasant for everyone involved. The kind of confrontation that would make the other passengers uncomfortable and create tension in the cabin that would linger for the entire flight, making her own job more difficult as she tried to maintain a pleasant atmosphere while dealing with the aftermath of whatever was about to happen. Or maybe he's one of those tech guys who dress casual but have money. You know how they are these days, wearing hoodies to board meetings and showing up at fancy restaurants in sneakers because they don't feel like they need to prove anything to anyone. "I know what money looks like," Chelsea replied, her voice dripping with the kind of condescension that comes from years of believing that your judgment is superior to everyone else's, that your ability to assess people and situations is so refined and accurate that you don't need to actually verify your assumptions before acting on them. And I know what trouble looks like, and that man is trouble waiting to happen, the kind of problem that's going to create issues for everyone on this flight if we don't handle it immediately and decisively before it has a chance to escalate into something even more problematic. She paused for dramatic effect, letting her words sink in before delivering what she clearly considered to be the most important piece of information, the detail that would make Jasmine understand why this situation required immediate action rather than the kind of wait-and-see approach that might be appropriate for less serious concerns. "We have Senator Margaret Wellington boarding in 5 minutes, and she's sitting in 3C right next to him." Chelsea continued, her voice taking on an even more urgent tone as she outlined the stakes of the situation. "I will not have some vagrant disrupting the senator's flight because nobody had the backbone to handle an obvious problem when they saw one, because everyone was too afraid of being politically incorrect or whatever, to do what clearly needs to be done to protect the experience of our most important passengers." Jasmine glanced toward Damon again, taking in his relaxed posture and peaceful expression, the way his chest rose and fell with the deep, even breathing of someone in genuine sleep, trying to reconcile what she was actually seeing with what Chelsea was describing, trying to understand how a sleeping passenger could possibly constitute the kind of threat or problem that required this level of intervention and concern. "But if he's in the seat, he must have a valid ticket," she reasoned, her voice carrying the kind of logic that should have ended the conversation before it started, the kind of simple observation that should have made everyone stop and reconsider whether they were making assumptions that weren't supported by the actual facts of the situation. The gate systems won't let you board without proper documentation, and the agents are usually pretty careful about checking, especially for first-class passengers. Or he slipped past the gate agent when they were overwhelmed with the late boarding. Chelsea insisted, her bias clouding her judgment in ways that would have been obvious to anyone who wasn't already convinced they were right. Anyone who wasn't so committed to their initial assessment that they couldn't see any alternative explanation for what they were observing. "It happens more than you think, especially on these late flights when everyone is tired and not paying as much attention as they should be when the agents are just trying to get people on board so the flight can depart on time and they don't get blamed for delays that affect the entire schedule for the rest of the night. She straightened her shoulders and adjusted her scarf one final time, preparing herself for the confrontation she had decided was necessary and inevitable. "I'm going to handle this situation before Senator Wellington boards," she announced with the kind of determination that usually preceded disaster, "because we are absolutely not departing with a security risk sitting in the front row of this aircraft. Not on my watch. Not when I have the authority and the responsibility to maintain standards and protect the experience of passengers who actually belong in first class." Brittany's first tap on Damon's shoulder wasn't gentle or respectful in the way that hospitality training programs teach service professionals to wake sleeping passengers, acknowledging that sleep is precious and that being jolted awake can be disorienting and unpleasant even under the best circumstances. Instead, it was the kind of aggressive physical contact that immediately established her as someone who had already decided this was going to be a confrontation, rather than a conversation, someone who wasn't interested in giving the benefit of the doubt or approaching the situation with any degree of courtesy or consideration for the passenger's comfort or dignity. When he didn't respond immediately to that first touch, when his body remained relaxed and his breathing stayed deep and even, because he was genuinely asleep rather than just pretending or resting with his eyes closed, she tapped again this time, digging her perfectly manicured nails slightly into the fabric of his hoodie with enough pressure to make her intentions unmistakably clear, to communicate through touch alone, that she wasn't asking nicely or making a polite request, but demanding immediate compliance with her unspoken command to wake up right now and deal with whatever issue she had decided needed to be addressed. "Sir," she said, her voice loud enough that Jonathan Park, a tech executive sitting in seat 4A, who had been deeply absorbed in reviewing documents on his tablet, looked up with a startled expression, and Dorothy Foster, an elderly woman in seat 4B who had been reading a paperback novel that her book club had recommended, shifted in her seat to get a better view of what was happening just a few rows ahead of her. "I need to see your boarding pass immediately, and I need to see it right now, not in a minute, or when you feel like it, but this very second, because we have procedures that need to be followed, and I don't have time to wait around while you decide whether or not you feel like cooperating with reasonable requests from crew members." There was no good evening, or sorry to disturb you, or any of the basic courtesies that should have been automatic when dealing with a paying passenger, especially one who was doing nothing more threatening or disruptive than trying to sleep in a seat that he had every right to occupy, based on the boarding pass that was presumably somewhere in his pockets or his bag or his phone ready to be produced if anyone had a legitimate reason to request it. Instead, there was only the kind of sharp authority that came from someone who had spent 17 years believing that her judgment was infallible and her authority was absolute. Someone who expected passengers to respond immediately to her demands without question or hesitation, recognizing that she represented the airline and that her word was law within the confines of the aircraft cabin. Damon stirred slowly, climbing up from the depths of the kind of sleep that his body desperately needed after days of pushing himself beyond reasonable limits, confused and disoriented as he pulled one earbud out with fumbling fingers and squinted against the cabin lights that seemed impossibly bright after the darkness behind his closed eyelids, like someone had turned on stadium lights directly in his face without warning or consideration for the fact that his eyes needed time to adjust. "Yeah," he said, his voice thick with exhaustion and the kind of grogginess that comes from being pulled out of deep sleep without warning, when your brain hasn't had time to make the transition from unconsciousness to full awareness, and you're still trying to figure out where you are and what's happening and why someone is bothering you, when all you want to do is close your eyes again and go back to that peaceful place where nothing hurts and nothing demands your attention. "I need to see your boarding pass," Chelsea demanded. crossing her arms across her chest in a gesture that was clearly designed to intimidate rather than assist, her entire posture radiating the kind of hostile authority that had no place in an industry that was supposed to be built on service and hospitality and making people feel welcome rather than threatened. "We have a discrepancy with the passenger manifest, and I need to verify your documentation before we can proceed with departure, because we can't have people sitting in seats they're not supposed to be and creating security risks and potentially causing problems that could affect the entire flight." This was a complete fabrication, a lie told with the kind of confidence that comes from years of believing that passengers will simply accept whatever they're told by someone in uniform, that they won't question or challenge statements made by crew members, because they assume that anyone wearing official airline clothing must be telling the truth and must have legitimate reasons for making whatever demands they're making. Chelsea hadn't even looked at the passenger manifest, yet hadn't made any effort to verify anything through the computer systems that would have immediately shown her that Damon Rivera was exactly where he was supposed to be sitting in exactly the seat he had paid for, because she wasn't interested in facts or documentation or what the official records might say about the situation. She was interested in creating enough confusion and pressure to force Damon to admit that he had somehow gained unauthorized access to first class, to get him to voluntarily move to economy, or leave the aircraft entirely without her having to produce any actual evidence that he didn't belong in the seat he was occupying, relying on the assumption that most people would rather comply than create a scene or argue with someone who seemed so absolutely certain of their position. Damon blinked several times trying to process what was being asked of him, while his brain struggled to shift from the deep relaxation of sleep to the alertness required to deal with whatever this situation was turning into, fighting through the fog of exhaustion to understand why someone was standing over him, making demands when he hadn't done anything wrong as far as he could tell. "I scanned it at the gate," he said, his voice carrying the kind of reasonable confusion that any passenger might feel when confronted with an unexpected request that didn't seem to make any sense based on the normal procedures for boarding an aircraft. The system accepted it. Green light, no problems. The gate agent smiled and told me to have a good flight. "I need to see it now," Chelsea insisted, her voice getting sharper with each exchange, deliberately calibrated to make him feel defensive and uncertain about his right to be there, to create doubt in his mind about whether he had actually followed the correct procedures or whether he had somehow made a mistake that was now coming back to cause problems. "We have protocols that must be followed, and I cannot allow this aircraft to depart until we've resolved this security issue, until I'm completely satisfied that everyone in this cabin has proper authorization to be here, and that we're not putting other passengers at risk by allowing someone to remain on board who shouldn't be here in the first place." The word security was chosen deliberately, designed to make other passengers pay attention and become concerned about what was happening, to establish in their minds that Damon represented some kind of threat that needed to be managed and contained, that Chelsea was protecting them from a potential danger, rather than harassing an innocent passenger based on nothing more than his choice of clothing and the color of his skin. The commotion that had been building in the rows just ahead finally penetrated through the cocoon of sleep that had wrapped around 9-year-old Lyra Rivera, pulling her up from whatever pleasant dreams had been occupying her mind and forcing her into a reality that was confusing and frightening in ways that her young mind struggled to process. She rubbed her eyes with small fists, trying to clear away the blur of sleep and understand what was happening, why there were raised voices, and why her father was talking to someone who sounded angry. Why the peaceful atmosphere of the aircraft cabin had been replaced with this tension that she could feel even without fully understanding what was causing it. Her stuffed elephant, a faithful companion that had traveled with her on countless flights and had been present for every important moment of her young life, from bedtime stories to doctor's appointments to the funeral of her mother 5 years ago, was still tucked securely under her arm where she had placed it before falling asleep, its soft fabric providing a small measure of comfort in a situation that was becoming increasingly uncomfortable and strange. The airplane blanket that her father had carefully wrapped around her before taking his own seat was still draped across her legs, but she pushed it aside now as she sat up straighter, trying to see over the seat back to understand what was happening to her daddy, and why that woman in the blue uniform was standing so close to him and talking in that tone that adults used when they were upset about something. "Daddy." Her voice was small and frightened, cutting through the tension in the cabin like a knife through butter. The innocent confusion of a child who couldn't understand why grown-ups were acting this way, piercing through all the adult posturing and professional authority to get at the simple truth of the situation, which was that a sleeping man was being harassed for no good reason that anyone could actually articulate if they were forced to explain their actions in plain language. "What's happening? Why is she yelling at you? Did you do something wrong?" Damon's expression immediately softened when he looked at his daughter, the controlled anger that had been starting to build in his chest giving way to something gentler and more protective. The instinct of a parent to shield their child from unpleasantness and confusion, even when that unpleasantness is happening right in front of them and can't be hidden or explained away with simple reassurances. "It's okay, sweetheart," he said, his voice calm, despite the absurdity of the situation he found himself in, despite the fact that he was being treated like a criminal for the crime of trying to sleep in a seat he had paid thousands of dollars to occupy. "Just a misunderstanding. Go back to sleep, baby. Everything's going to be fine." But Lyra was wide awake now, the fear that had initially clouded her expression being replaced by confusion and the kind of direct curiosity that only children possess the ability to ask questions that adults dance around or avoid entirely because they expose uncomfortable truths that everyone would rather not acknowledge. She looked at Chelsea with eyes that hadn't yet learned to hide what they were thinking, without the layers of social conditioning that teach adults to be polite even when they're witnessing injustice, and asked the question that was forming in her mind with the straightforward simplicity that comes from not yet understanding that some truths are supposed to remain unspoken. "Did my daddy do something bad? He bought our tickets. I watched him do it on his computer at the hotel. He showed me our seat numbers and everything." Chelsea's face flushed slightly, not expecting to have a child witness to this confrontation, not having planned for the complication of a small girl who might ask inconvenient questions or say things that would make the situation more difficult to manage in the way that Chelsea had envisioned when she first decided that the man in seat 3A needed to be removed from her first-class cabin. "Young lady," she said, her voice taking on the kind of condescending tone that adults sometimes use when talking to children they consider to be interfering in matters that don't concern them. "This is adult business that doesn't involve you. Your father needs to show proper identification to prove that he has authorization to be sitting in this seat, and once he does that, everything will be fine, and you can go back to sleep." But Lyra wasn't intimidated by the authority in Chelsea's voice, or the uniform she wore, or any of the other things that might have made an adult hesitate to continue questioning what was happening. She persisted with the kind of simple child logic that cut through all the complexity and justification that adults wrapped around their actions to make themselves feel better about choices that they knew deep down weren't right. "But he showed it at the gate," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the cabin that had gone almost completely silent as other passengers stopped what they were doing to watch this interaction unfold. "The lady there smiled at us and said, 'Welcome aboard,' and told us to have a good flight. If Daddy didn't have the right ticket, she wouldn't have let us on the airplane, would she?" Other passengers were now fully attentive to what was happening in row 3, some of them pulling out their phones to record what they were witnessing, because something about this situation felt wrong in a way that they couldn't quite articulate, but that they recognized from other incidents they had seen or heard about situations where assumptions were made and authority was wielded in ways that had more to do with bias and prejudice than with any legitimate concern for safety or security. Dorothy Foster, the elderly woman in seat 4B, was peering through the gap between the seats with an expression that combined concern and disapproval, though her disapproval was clearly directed at Chelsea rather than at the man who was being harassed, because even from her limited vantage point, she could see that something wasn't right about how this situation was being handled. Damon's frown deepened as the confusion in his expression gave way to something sharper and more knowing, the dawning realization that this wasn't actually about passenger manifests or security protocols or any of the official reasons that Chelsea was claiming to justify her actions. "That's impossible," he said, his voice carrying a note of certainty that suggested he wasn't going to be easily intimidated or confused into accepting Chelsea's version of reality. "I booked this seat 3 hours ago through your premium reservation system, paid full fare with my corporate credit card, and received confirmation immediately with a booking reference number, and everything else that comes with a legitimate purchase. There's no way my name isn't in your system, unless something is very wrong with your computer systems, in which case you should be calling IT support, rather than harassing passengers." "Sir, you are holding up this flight," Chelsea replied, deliberately, raising her voice so that other passengers would hear and understand that she was dealing with a problem. Passenger who was being unreasonable and uncooperative. Someone who was making things difficult for everyone else who just wanted to get home or get to their destination without dealing with unnecessary drama and delays. "If you cannot produce a physical ticket or digital boarding pass immediately, I am going to have to ask you to return to the economy cabin where you actually belong or leave the aircraft entirely so that we can depart on schedule and not inconvenience the other passengers who have places to be and schedules to keep." The word economy hit Damon like a physical blow to the stomach, not because there was anything wrong with economy class, or the people who flew in it, because he had spent plenty of time in economy seats during the years when he was building his company from nothing, and couldn't afford the luxury of premium cabins, but because of the implication behind the way Chelsea said it, the suggestion that someone like him didn't belong in first class, that his presence there was somehow illegitimate or inappropriate, that he should be grateful for being allowed on the aircraft at all, rather than expecting to sit in the seats reserved for people who actually mattered. A sharp edge crept into Damon's voice as he sat up straighter in his seat, the exhaustion beginning to give way to something that looked a lot like controlled anger, the kind of cold fury that comes from being treated unjustly, and knowing that you have every right to be upset about it, but also knowing that showing too much emotion will only be used against you as evidence that you're being aggressive or difficult. "Likely story," Chelsea muttered, but she made sure to say it just loud enough for Damon to hear the words designed to question his honesty and integrity, without giving him anything concrete to respond to, allowing her to plant doubt in the minds of the other passengers without having to actually defend her position with facts or evidence. It was the kind of passive-aggressive attack that allowed her to maintain plausible deniability while making her true feelings crystal clear to everyone within earshot, the suggestion that he was lying about having purchased the ticket that he had somehow sneaked onto the aircraft, or scammed his way into first class through deception or fraud. "Excuse me," Damon said, his voice carrying the kind of quiet intensity that should have warned Chelsea that she was pushing someone who was not going to be easily pushed, someone who had dealt with far more sophisticated attempts at intimidation than anything a flight attendant could throw at him, someone who had sat across the table from hostile corporate executives and aggressive lawyers and government regulators who all thought they could break him if they just applied enough pressure. "I said we need to keep this cabin clear for our first-class passengers," Chelsea replied, her tone dripping with the kind of condescension that was designed to make him feel small and out of place, as if his very presence was contaminating the refined atmosphere that real first-class passengers deserved and had paid good money to enjoy. "You are clearly in the wrong seat, and we need to resolve this situation before it becomes an even bigger problem than it already is." She continued, her voice rising slightly as she committed more fully to the confrontation she had initiated. She gestured toward the overhead compartment with the kind of imperious authority that suggested she was accustomed to having her orders followed without question, accustomed to passengers meekly complying with whatever she told them to do, because they recognized that she held all the power in this situation, and that resistance would only make things worse for them. "Now grab your bag and let's go," she commanded her words, leaving no room for negotiation or discussion. "Senator Wellington is waiting to board, and I will not have her stepping over you to get to her seat, because nobody had the backbone to handle an obvious situation when they saw one, because everyone was too concerned with being politically correct or avoiding confrontation to do what clearly needed to be done to maintain proper standards in this cabin. Damon looked at her, really looked at her, taking in every detail of her appearance and demeanor, with the kind of careful assessment that comes from years of dealing with people who believe their authority gives them the right to treat others however they choose, people who think that having a title or wearing a uniform makes them superior to everyone else and exempts them from having to treat others with basic human decency and respect. He saw the name tag that read C. Bradford Head Purser in small engraved letters that proclaimed her status and seniority. He saw the sneer that she wasn't even bothering to hide anymore, the expression of disgust and superiority that had probably been there from the beginning, but was now fully visible as she became more confident that she had the upper hand in this situation. And he saw the complete lack of professional courtesy that should have been automatic when dealing with any passenger, regardless of what they were wearing or what they looked like, regardless of whether they fit Chelsea's mental image of what a first-class passenger should be. This wasn't the first time Damon had encountered this particular look. This combination of disgust and dismissal that suggested his very existence was somehow offensive to people who considered themselves his social superiors. People who couldn't imagine that someone who looked like him could possibly have earned the right to occupy the same spaces they occupied or enjoy the same privileges they enjoyed. He had seen it in department stores where security guards followed him around as if he were planning to shoplift something, despite the fact that he was wearing expensive clothes and carrying shopping bags from other high-end stores in the mall. He had seen it in hotel lobbies where desk clerks questioned his reservations as if someone like him couldn't possibly afford to stay in a 5-star property, asking for additional forms of identification and credit cards beyond what was normally required, making him prove his right to be there in ways that white guests were never asked to prove anything. And he had seen it at valet stands where attendants assumed he was there to pick up someone else's car, rather than claiming his own vehicle, handing him keys to cars that belonged to other people, because they couldn't imagine that the expensive sports car sitting in the premium spot might actually belong to the tall black man in casual clothes standing in front of them. Usually, when faced with this kind of treatment, Damon would pull out his American Express black card with its distinctive weight and appearance, or mention his company and his position as CEO, or provide some other evidence of his financial status and social position, watching as attitudes shifted dramatically once people realized they were dealing with someone who had the power to make their lives difficult, someone who could file complaints with corporate headquarters or write scathing reviews online, or otherwise cause problems for employees who had made the mistake of judging him based on his appearance, rather than treating him with the basic courtesy that should be extended to every customer, regardless of what they looked like. It was an effective strategy that usually resulted in immediate apologies and improved service, and sometimes even complimentary upgrades or other gestures designed to smooth over the awkwardness of the situation and prevent him from making a bigger issue out of what had happened. But it was also exhausting, and it did nothing to address the underlying problem that created these situations in the first place, the deep-seated biases and assumptions that made people look at him and see a threat or a problem rather than a human being who deserved to be treated with dignity and respect. Tonight was different, though. Tonight he was tired enough that the idea of engaging in his usual routine felt like more effort than he could manage, more energy than he had left to spare after days of negotiations and travel and all the other demands that had brought him to this point. But he was also curious about something that he couldn't quite name. Some desire to understand exactly how far Chelsea Bradford would be willing to take this. How committed she was to her assumptions about who belonged in first class and who didn't. What it would take to make her question whether she was making a terrible mistake that she would come to regret. "You're making a mistake," Bradford Damon said calmly, reading her name tag and settling back into his seat with the kind of relaxed confidence that suggested he had no intention of going anywhere, regardless of what she might demand or threaten. regardless of how much authority she claimed to have or how insistent she was that he needed to comply with her orders immediately. "That's Ms. Bradford to you." She snapped, her face flushing with the kind of anger that comes from having your authority questioned by someone you consider to be beneath your notice. Someone who should be grateful that you're even speaking to them rather than having them removed from the aircraft without the courtesy of an explanation. And the only mistake here is you thinking you could sneak into a $7,200 suite wearing a hoodie and sneakers. Like you're going to some college basketball game instead of traveling on a premium airline that has standards and expectations for how passengers should present themselves in first class. By this time, other passengers throughout the first-class cabin were watching the interaction with growing interest and discomfort, recognizing on some level that something was seriously wrong with the way this situation was being handled. That the level of hostility and certainty being displayed by the flight attendant didn't match the actual circumstances of what was happening, which, as far as they could tell, was simply a sleeping passenger being harassed for no apparent reason. Jonathan Park, the tech executive in seat 4A, had his hand hovering over his phone, torn between his instinct to document what was happening so that there would be a record of it if things escalated further, and his reluctance to get involved in someone else's confrontation to become part of a situation that might reflect poorly on him or create complications that he didn't want to deal with when he was just trying to get home after a long business trip. Dorothy Foster in seat 4B was peering through the gap between the seats with an expression that combined concern and disapproval, though her disapproval was clearly directed at Chelsea rather than at Damon, because even from her limited vantage point, she could see that the flight attendant was behaving inappropriately, and that the passenger being harassed hadn't actually done anything to warrant this kind of treatment. Lyra clutched her stuffed elephant tighter against her chest, her small hands gripping the soft fabric, as if it could protect her from whatever was happening between her father and this angry woman. In the uniform, her eyes wide with a mixture of confusion and fear, as she tried to understand why grown-ups were acting this way, why her daddy was being treated like he had done something wrong when she knew he hadn't. When she had been with him the whole time and had seen him buy the tickets and check them in and do everything exactly the way you were supposed to do it. "I'm not moving," Damon said with finality, putting his earbud back in with a deliberate gesture that was designed to signal that he considered the conversation to be over, that he had said everything he needed to say, and wasn't interested in continuing this pointless argument with someone who had clearly already made up her mind and wasn't going to be persuaded by facts or logic or anything else he might say in his own defense. "Check the manifest again properly this time, and you'll find everything you need to know about who I am and why I have every right to be sitting in this seat." Chelsea's face turned a blotchy shade of red that clashed dramatically with her carefully applied makeup, her anger and frustration boiling over as she realized that her usual tactics weren't working the way they were supposed to, that this passenger wasn't responding to her authority in the way that passengers were supposed to respond, with immediate compliance and apologies and a rush to prove that they weren't the kind of person she was suggesting they might be. For 17 years, she had been the undisputed queen of first-class cabins, the person whose word was law and whose authority was never questioned by passengers who understood their place in the hierarchy of air travel and who recognized that fighting with a flight attendant was a losing proposition that would only end badly for them. But this passenger was different in ways that she couldn't quite process, different in ways that made her feel uncertain and off balance, despite her years of experience and her confidence in her own judgment. He wasn't intimidated by her uniform or her title or her obvious disapproval of his presence in her cabin. He wasn't apologizing or making excuses or scrambling to prove that he belonged there to demonstrate that he had the financial resources and social status that she believed were necessary prerequisites for sitting in first class. Instead, he was treating her like someone whose opinion didn't matter, like someone who was bothering him, rather than someone whose authority he should respect and fear, like she was an annoying interruption to his sleep, rather than a legitimate representative of the airline with the power to remove him from the aircraft if she deemed it necessary. She couldn't let this stand, not in front of her crew who were watching to see how she would handle this situation, not in front of the senator who was about to board and who would judge the airline based on how well the crew maintained order and standards in the premium cabin, and not in front of the other passengers who were watching to see whether she was going to maintain control of her cabin or allow herself to be disrespected by someone who clearly didn't understand how things worked in her domain. Chelsea turned on her heel with a sharp movement that made her uniform skirt swish dramatically, marching back to the galley with strides that were sharp and angry, her frustration evident in every line of her body as she realized that her usual approach wasn't going to work with this particular passenger, and that she was going to need to escalate the situation in order to regain control and demonstrate to everyone watching that she was still the authority in this cabin and that her decisions would be respected whether passengers liked it or not. Jasmine Chen was busy preparing the welcome champagne service when Chelsea returned to the galley, arranging crystal flutes on a silver tray with the kind of careful attention to detail that spoke of someone who took pride in her work, even when that work involved tasks that might seem mundane or unimportant to outside observers. Someone who believed that doing small things well was just as important as handling the big dramatic moments that everyone noticed and remembered. Jasmine Chelsea hissed, her voice dropping to the kind of harsh whisper that somehow managed to sound more threatening than if she had simply spoken at normal volume. The kind of tone that made it clear she was upset, and that whatever was about to happen was going to be serious and potentially unpleasant for everyone involved. The young flight attendant looked up from her work with the kind of immediate attention that comes from recognizing that your supervisor is upset about something, and that your immediate response could determine whether you're going to be part of the solution or part of the problem, whether you're going to be praised for your quick thinking and support, or blamed for somehow contributing to whatever crisis was unfolding. "Call the captain." Chelsea ordered, her words coming out in a rush as her heart raced with the adrenaline that comes from conflict and confrontation, from the decision to escalate a situation beyond the point where it can be easily walked back or resolved through simple conversation and compromise. "Tell him we have a non-compliant passenger in 3A who refuses to identify himself properly and is becoming verbally aggressive with crew members, creating a security situation that requires immediate attention before it escalates into something even more serious that could threaten the safety of the aircraft and everyone on board. I want him removed from this aircraft before we have a bigger problem on our hands, before Senator Wellington boards and witnesses this disruption, before other passengers start questioning whether we're maintaining proper security protocols and whether they're safe flying on an airline that allows people to board without proper documentation and verification." Jasmine's eyes widened as she processed what she was being asked to do, glancing toward seat 3, where Damon had simply closed his eyes again and was resting his head against the seat back in a posture that looked anything but aggressive, where a small girl was sitting quietly with her stuffed animal, looking worried and confused but not causing any problems or disturbances that would justify calling for security intervention. Aggressive, she asked, her voice carrying the kind of uncertainty that comes from being asked to report something that doesn't match what you've actually observed with your own eyes. Being told to describe a situation in terms that don't align with reality as you understand it. But he's just sitting there quietly. He hasn't raised his voice or made any threats, and there's a child with him who seems frightened by all this. He was verbally threatening Chelsea, lied the words coming out with the kind of practiced authority that suggested she was describing actual events rather than fabricating a narrative that would justify the action she wanted to take, creating a version of reality that supported her decision to escalate rather than de-escalate to call for help, rather than admitting that she might have made a mistake in her initial assessment of the situation. He refused to show proper identification when requested, used profanity when speaking to me about the situation, and made statements that could be interpreted as threats against crew members and other passengers, suggesting that there would be consequences if we didn't leave him alone and let him continue occupying a seat that he has no legitimate right to be sitting in. Jasmine hesitated, torn between her instinct to question what she was being told because it didn't match what she had actually witnessed, and her understanding that challenging a supervisor with 17 years of experience could have serious consequences for her own career, could mark her as someone who wasn't a team player or who questioned authority in ways that made her unsuitable for positions of greater responsibility. She had been flying for only 9 months, long enough to understand the basic requirements of her job and to have developed some confidence in her ability to handle routine situations, but not nearly long enough to feel confident about questioning the judgment of someone who outranked her by such a significant margin. Someone who had been doing this work since before Jasmine was even thinking about a career in aviation. "Do it now!" Chelsea barked, her voice rising just enough to make it clear that she wasn't interested in discussion or debate or any kind of questioning of her orders, that she expected her instructions to be followed immediately and without hesitation or second-guessing, because time was running out and Senator Wellington would be boarding any minute, and this situation needed to be resolved before then. "Call the flight deck and tell them we need security at the gate immediately. This passenger needs to be removed before Senator Wellington boards, and I will not have this aircraft's departure delayed, because nobody had the backbone to handle an obvious problem when they saw one, because everyone was too worried about political correctness or avoiding confrontation to do what clearly needed to be done." With trembling hands that betrayed her deep discomfort with the situation, but also her inability to effectively challenge what she was being told to do, Jasmine picked up the interphone that connected the cabin crew with the flight deck, knowing that once she made this call, events would be set in motion that couldn't easily be reversed, that security officers would be summoned and a sleeping passenger would be confronted and possibly arrested based on nothing more than a flight attendant's insistence that he didn't belong in the seat he was occupying. "Flight deck." "This is cabin crew," she said, her voice barely steady as she prepared to report something that didn't feel right, but that she didn't have the experience or authority or courage to question effectively, to push back against in a way that might actually change the course of events that were now beginning to unfold. 2 minutes later, the sound of heavy footsteps echoed down the jet bridge as Port Authority police officers responded to what they had been told was a security situation involving an uncooperative passenger who was refusing to follow crew instructions and potentially threatening other travelers. The kind of call that required immediate response, because any delay could mean the difference between a situation that could be managed peacefully and one that escalated into something much more serious and potentially dangerous. Officer Marcus Thompson was a burly man in his mid-40s, with 20 years of experience dealing with every kind of airport disturbance imaginable, from drunk passengers who couldn't understand why they weren't being allowed to board their flights to actual security threats that required careful handling and quick thinking to resolve without anyone getting hurt. His partner, Officer Lisa Martinez, was newer to the job with only 3 years under her belt, but she was equally prepared to handle whatever situation they might encounter, having been trained in de-escalation techniques and proper procedures for dealing with passengers who were causing problems on aircraft or in terminals. They looked annoyed rather than particularly concerned as they made their way toward the aircraft, because late-night calls to planes sitting at gates were never simple, and usually involved dealing with people who had made poor decisions about alcohol consumption or medication timing. People who thought the normal rules didn't apply to them because they were tired or stressed or important enough that flight attendants should make exceptions for their behavior. Their body language suggested that they expected to find nothing more serious than a passenger who had gotten mouthy with a flight attendant and needed to be reminded about the federal laws regarding interference with flight operations and the very serious consequences that could result from continuing to be difficult or uncooperative with crew members who were just trying to do their jobs and get the aircraft safely from one city to another. Chelsea was waiting for them at the entrance to the first-class cabin, her arms crossed over her chest and her expression radiating the kind of smug satisfaction that comes from knowing that you're about to be proven right in front of everyone who doubted your judgment, vindicated in your decision to take action, rather than letting a potentially dangerous situation continue to develop unchecked. She had spent 17 years building her reputation as someone who maintained standards and protected the first-class experience from anything or anyone that might diminish it. and she wasn't about to let one difficult passenger undermine everything she had worked to establish, wasn't going to allow her authority to be questioned or her decisions to be second-guessed by people who didn't understand what it took to maintain proper standards in a premium cabin. "Where is he?" Officer Thompson asked, his hand resting instinctively near the taser on his duty belt in a gesture that spoke of someone who was prepared for the possibility that this situation might escalate beyond simple conversation, who had learned through years of experience that you could never be entirely sure how a confrontation was going to unfold, and that being prepared for the worst-case scenario was always better than being caught off guard by a passenger who turned out to be more aggressive or violent than initial reports had suggested. His eyes swept the first-class cabin, taking in the well-dressed passengers, and the refined atmosphere, and the general air of expensive comfort, trying to identify which person, among all these obviously affluent and successful-looking travelers, was causing problems significant enough to require police intervention and potential removal from the aircraft. Chelsea pointed toward seat 3. Like an accuser in a witch trial might point toward the person she was convinced had brought misfortune to the community. Her finger trembling slightly with the adrenaline and anger that had been building throughout this entire encounter, with the conviction that she was doing the right thing, even though some small part of her mind might have been starting to wonder whether she had perhaps acted too hastily or made assumptions that weren't entirely justified by the actual facts of the situation. "He's refusing to leave his seat," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the cabin that had gone almost completely silent as passengers stopped what they were doing to watch this drama unfold, each word chosen carefully to paint Damon as the aggressor, and herself as the victim of unreasonable behavior from someone who should have simply complied with her reasonable requests. "He has no valid ticket for first class, and he threatened me when I tried to resolve this situation peacefully and professionally by asking him to provide proper documentation or relocate to a seat that he actually has authorization to occupy." Officer Thompson adjusted his equipment belt with the kind of practiced movement that cops make dozens of times per shift, preparing himself mentally and physically for whatever was about to happen, and began walking toward Damon with the kind of heavy, deliberate footsteps that were designed to announce his presence and establish his authority before any conversation began. Each step seeming to echo through the cabin with unusual loudness, as if the aircraft itself were amplifying the sound to make sure everyone understood that law enforcement had arrived and that the situation was now moving into a different and potentially more serious phase. Each step seemed to carry weight beyond just the physical impact of his boots on the aircraft floor, announcing to everyone present that this situation had escalated from a customer service dispute into a potential federal crime involving interference with flight operations, which carried serious penalties, including possible jail time and permanent restrictions on future air travel for anyone convicted of such an offense. Damon Rivera opened his eyes as the shadow of the police officer fell across him, blocking out the ambient cabin lighting and replacing it with the dark outline of a large man in uniform, who was clearly there to deal with him in some official capacity. The expression on his face wasn't one of fear or anger or even surprise at this development, which perhaps should have been shocking given that he had done nothing wrong and had every right to be sitting exactly where he was sitting. But instead, it was the weary look of someone who had been through variations of this before, in different contexts and different situations, who recognized exactly what was happening here and understood that protesting or explaining wouldn't make any difference to people who had already made up their minds about what they were seeing and what it meant. Jonathan Park, watching from seat 4, would later tell people that it was that expression, that look of disappointed recognition rather than shocked indignation or outraged innocence, that made him realize this wasn't the first time something like this had happened to the man in seat 3A, that this kind of profiling and assumption-making based on appearance was something that Damon had learned to expect as a regular feature of his life, rather than as an unusual aberration that shocked him into protest and demands for justice. It was the face of someone who had learned through bitter experience that his appearance would be judged before his character, that his right to occupy spaces would be questioned based on assumptions rather than facts, that he would be required to prove his legitimacy and his right to be treated with basic human dignity in ways that other people would never be asked to prove anything at all. Lyra, still holding her stuffed elephant in a grip tight enough that her knuckles were turning white, sat up straighter in her seat and looked at the police officer with eyes that were wide with fear, but also with a kind of defiant protectiveness that was remarkable in someone so young, a determination not to let anything bad happen to her father, even though she had no real power to prevent whatever was about to occur. "Daddy," she said, her small voice somehow carrying through all the tension and adult posturing. "Are those police? What's happening? You didn't do anything wrong. Why are they here, sir?" Officer Thompson boomed his voice, designed to intimidate and establish dominance before any conversation could begin to make it clear from the very first word that he was in charge now, and that whatever the passenger might want to say in his own defense would be secondary to the authority that the officer represented. "I need you to get out of that seat right now and come with us. You're being removed from this aircraft for failure to comply with crew instructions and for creating a disturbance that threatens the safety and security of other passengers, which are both serious violations of federal law that carry significant penalties if you choose to continue resisting or making this situation more difficult than it needs to be." The words were delivered with the kind of authority that cops use when they want to make it absolutely clear that resistance will only make things worse, that the time for discussion or negotiation has passed, and that the only acceptable response is immediate compliance with whatever orders are being given, regardless of whether those orders are justified or whether the person being given them has actually done anything to warrant this kind of intervention. But Damon didn't look intimidated or defensive in the way that Thompson had probably expected, based on Chelsea's description of him as aggressive and threatening. Instead, he looked past Officer Thompson to where Chelsea Bradford stood safely behind the galley counter, watching the scene unfold with obvious satisfaction that her call for backup had been answered so quickly and with such an impressive show of force. "You really called the cops?" Damon asked softly, his voice carrying a note of genuine sadness rather than anger, as if he was disappointed in humanity, rather than surprised by this particular turn of events, as if this was confirmation of something he had hoped wasn't true but had suspected all along. The question wasn't accusatory or confrontational in the way that might have justified Chelsea's claims about him being verbally aggressive. It was the kind of weary inquiry that comes from someone who had hoped for better but hadn't really expected it, who understood that some people would always judge based on appearance rather than character, and that no amount of success or achievement would fully protect him from those judgments. "You gave me no choice," Chelsea replied from her position of safety behind the counter where the officers' bodies created a barrier between her and any potential retaliation from the passenger. She had accused her voice, carrying the kind of righteous indignation that comes from believing you've taken appropriate action against someone who brought consequences on themselves through their own poor behavior and bad choices, who forced you to escalate the situation by refusing to simply comply with reasonable requests that any legitimate passenger would have had no problem fulfilling. Damon nodded slowly, the gesture suggesting acceptance rather than agreement, as if he understood that this was how the situation was going to play out regardless of what he said or did, regardless of how much evidence he could produce of his right to be sitting exactly where he was sitting. "Okay," he said quietly, his voice carrying a resignation that came from understanding that sometimes you couldn't win certain battles no matter how right you were or how wrong the other side was. "But just remember that I gave you multiple chances to check your passenger list properly before we got to this point. Multiple opportunities to verify information through official channels rather than making assumptions based on nothing more than what you thought you saw when you looked at me." Lyra's small hands grabbed onto her father's arm, her fingers digging into the fabric of his hoodie with the kind of desperate grip that children use when they're trying to prevent something bad from happening to someone they love when they don't fully understand what's going on, but they know it's wrong and they want to make it stop. Don't hurt my daddy, she cried out, her voice breaking with emotion as tears started streaming down her face. He didn't do anything bad. He bought our tickets. I saw him. Get out of seat now! Thompson shouted, reaching for Damon's arm with the kind of aggressive movement that suggested his patience was running out and that he was prepared to use physical force if necessary to resolve this situation quickly and decisively, to remove this passenger from the aircraft before things got even more complicated or before other passengers started questioning whether this level of force was really necessary for someone who was just sitting quietly in a seat. I'm moving, Damon said, holding up his hand in a gesture designed to indicate cooperation, while also establishing that he didn't want to be touched unnecessarily, that he would comply with the officer's instructions, but that he expected to be treated with basic human dignity even in this humiliating situation. Don't put your hands on me. I'll comply with your instructions, but I'm not going to be manhandled when I haven't done anything wrong, and when I have every right to be sitting exactly where I am. He unbuckled his seatbelt with deliberate care, moving slowly and keeping his hands visible at all times, in the way that people learn to do when they've had negative interactions with law enforcement before, when they understand that any sudden movement or anything that could be interpreted as aggressive or threatening could escalate a tense situation into something much worse, could result in injuries or additional charges or other consequences that would make an already bad situation even more difficult to resolve. As he stood up, his full physical presence filled the cabin space in a way that his relaxed position in the seat hadn't revealed, showing that he was significantly taller and broader than most of the other passengers in first class, standing 6 feet 3 inches tall, with the kind of broad shoulders and controlled movement that spoke of someone who was physically imposing but had learned to manage his presence carefully, to avoid being perceived as threatening in ways that had nothing to do with his actual intentions or behavior. He moved with the controlled grace of someone who was comfortable with his own power and physical capabilities, but who understood that others might find his size intimidating or frightening, in ways that were completely disconnected from who he actually was as a person, or how he conducted himself in the world, in ways that had everything to do with stereotypes and assumptions about what black men were like and what they were capable of doing if given the opportunity. Lyra scrambled out of her own seat, her stuffed elephant falling to the floor, forgotten as she rushed to her father's side with small hands trying to push away the police officer's reaching arm, her 9-year-old body positioning itself between her daddy and these men who were trying to take him away, operating on pure instinct and love, without any real understanding of how powerless she was to actually prevent what was about to happen. Don't hurt my daddy, she cried again, her voice rising to a pitch that made several passengers wince in sympathy that cut through all the adult justifications and official procedures to get at the simple emotional truth of what was happening here, which was a child watching her father being treated like a criminal for no reason that made any sense to her young mind. Chelsea's face paled slightly as she watched the child's distress, perhaps beginning to realize on some level that this situation had gotten out of control in ways that she hadn't fully anticipated when she first decided to call security. That the optics of having a crying child witness her father being arrested were not good, regardless of how justified Chelsea believed her actions to be. But she didn't back down, or suggest that maybe they should reconsider what was happening. Didn't acknowledge that perhaps she had made a mistake in her initial assessment, or that the presence of a frightened child should change the calculus of how this situation was being handled. The passengers in economy class were craning their necks to see what was happening in first class, and several of them had already pulled out their phones to record whatever was taking place up there in the premium cabin, because the age of viral videos had trained everyone to document first and ask questions later, to capture everything on camera, because you never knew when something you witnessed might become important, or might need to be shared with a wider audience who deserved to know what was happening in spaces they couldn't normally access. This situation had all the hallmarks of something that might be worth capturing for posterity, something that people would want to see and share and comment on across social media platforms that had become the primary way that injustices were exposed and that powerful institutions were held accountable for their actions. Turn around. Officer Thompson ordered his voice, leaving no room for discussion or negotiation as he prepared to take the next step in this arrest procedure. Hands behind your back. You're being arrested for trespassing on an aircraft, which is a federal offense that carries serious penalties, including potential jail time and permanent restrictions on air travel. So you need to comply right now before you make this situation even worse for yourself than it already is. Am I actually under arrest? Damon asked, his voice calm and measured, despite the seriousness of the accusations being leveled against him and despite the fact that his young daughter was crying and trying to protect him from what was happening, despite the humiliation of being treated like a criminal in front of dozens of strangers who would remember this moment and would form opinions about him based on what they were witnessing. Because if so, I'd like to know specifically what crime you believe I've committed, since I have a valid boarding pass that was scanned and accepted by your airline systems, and I haven't interfered with flight operations in any way, unless you count trying to sleep in a seat I paid for as some kind of interference. Trespassing on an aircraft is a federal offense, Thompson replied with the kind of certainty that comes from having arrested people for this exact charge dozens of times before spinning Damon around without waiting for any further discussion and clicking handcuffs onto his wrists with more force than was strictly necessary. The sound of the metal closing loud enough in the suddenly silent cabin that it seemed to echo off the walls and ceiling a sharp metallic click that announced that this situation had moved beyond conversation and debate into the realm of serious legal consequences that couldn't be easily undone or walked back. The sound of those handcuffs closing seemed to hang in the air long after the actual noise had faded, becoming a kind of punctuation mark that divided the before and after of this moment, that separated the world where Damon Rivera was just another passenger trying to get home from the world where he was someone being arrested and removed from an aircraft in front of his terrified daughter and dozens of recording smartphones. Lyra's crying intensified into the kind of heartbroken sobbing that only children can produce, the sound of a world that had seemed safe and predictable suddenly revealing itself to be frightening and unjust in ways that her 9-year-old mind struggled to process or understand. "Daddy," she wailed, reaching for him, even though he couldn't reach back with his hands secured behind him. "Why are they doing this? You didn't do anything wrong. Tell them you didn't do anything wrong." Chelsea looked away from the child's distress, unable to meet those tear-filled eyes that were silently accusing her of being responsible for this pain, of being the person who had set all of this in motion with her assumptions and her refusal to simply check the information that would have immediately resolved the situation, without any need for police intervention or arrests or traumatized children watching their parents being treated like criminals. The handcuffs were still echoing in the silent cabin when a commotion erupted from the jet bridge, the sound of someone running up the stairs at full speed, taking them two at a time, with the kind of desperate urgency that suggested a genuine emergency was unfolding, that something terrible was happening that needed to be stopped immediately before it could get any worse or cause damage that couldn't be repaired. It wasn't the measured pace of a flight crew member going about their normal duties or heading to the aircraft to begin their pre-flight preparations. It was the frantic rush of someone who had just learned that something catastrophic was in progress and who needed to intervene right now, this very second, before events progressed past the point where they could be reversed or undone. Chief Pilot Amanda Rodriguez burst through the aircraft entrance with her uniform jacket half unbuttoned and her carefully styled hair coming loose from its usual neat arrangement. Her face flushed with panic and exertion as she struggled to catch her breath after sprinting through the terminal from the crew briefing room where she had just received the news that had sent her running toward this gate as fast as her legs could carry her. She was holding a tablet computer that was pinging frantically with urgent red notifications, the kind of alerts that were reserved for the most serious operational issues that required immediate attention from senior management. The kind of messages that meant something had gone terribly wrong, and that people's careers and possibly the airline's entire reputation were on the line depending on how quickly and effectively the situation could be resolved. "Stop!" Amanda yelled, her voice cracking with desperation as she took in the scene before her with horror-widened eyes, seeing Damon Rivera standing in handcuffs with a police officer holding his arm and a small girl crying hysterically while clutching a stuffed elephant and looking at her father with an expression of betrayal and confusion that no child should ever have to experience. "Nobody move. Don't take him anywhere. There's been a massive mistake. Oh my God. There's been a massive mistake." Officer Thompson paused in his movement toward the aircraft door, still holding Damon by the arm but looking confused about why the chief pilot was intervening in what seemed like a straightforward law enforcement matter, why she seemed so panicked about the removal of a passenger who had been reported as threatening and non-compliant by her own crew member. "We've got him." "Captain," he said, his voice carrying the kind of confidence that comes from believing you've handled a situation properly and professionally, according to all the correct procedures and protocols. "Trespasser, just like your crew called in. We'll have him processed and off your aircraft in 5 minutes, and then you can continue with your departure without any further delays or disruptions to your schedule." "Let him go," Amanda said, her chest heaving as she struggled to catch her breath and process the magnitude of what had almost happened. What would have happened if she hadn't received that notification from corporate headquarters and hadn't sprinted through the terminal to get here before the officers actually removed Damon from the aircraft and potentially created a public relations disaster that the airline might never fully recover from. She looked at Chelsea with an expression of absolute horror, as if she were staring at someone who had just committed an act of unimaginable stupidity that could cost both of them their careers and possibly destroy the airline's reputation in ways that would take years to repair if they could be repaired at all. "Chelsea, what have you done?" she whispered, though her words carried clearly in the deathly quiet cabin where every passenger was straining to hear what was being said. "Do you have any idea what you've just done? Do you have any idea who this man is?" "I removed a trespasser from first class," Chelsea said, confusion creeping into her voice as she tried to understand why the chief pilot was looking at her like she had just murdered someone, rather than simply following proper security procedures and maintaining the standards that she had been hired to maintain, that she had been praised for maintaining throughout her 17-year career with the airline. "I protected the cabin and maintained our service standards exactly like I've been doing for 17 years, exactly like I was trained to do, and exactly like every supervisor manual says I should do when I encounter a passenger who appears to be in the wrong seat, or who doesn't have proper documentation to justify their presence in a premium cabin." "Trespasser." Amanda's voice rose to nearly a shout, her professional composure completely abandoned as the full implications of the situation became clear to her, as she understood exactly what Chelsea had done and exactly how catastrophic the consequences were going to be if this situation wasn't handled immediately and perfectly, and with every possible measure taken to minimize the damage that had already been done. She looked at Damon, then down at her tablet with its urgent notifications from corporate headquarters and legal department and public relations, then back at Damon with an expression that combined recognition and horror, and the sick realization that her airline was about to become the center of a public relations nightmare that would make headlines around the world and would probably result in congressional hearings and investigations and all sorts of consequences that she couldn't even begin to imagine at this moment. She swallowed hard, trying to find words that could adequately express the magnitude of Chelsea's mistake without making the situation even worse than it already was, without adding to the trauma that Damon and his daughter had already experienced or creating additional problems that would have to be dealt with in the aftermath of this disaster. "That's not a trespasser," she whispered her words, carrying in the deathly quiet cabin where every passenger had stopped what they were doing to listen to what was unfolding in these crucial moments. "That's Mr. Rivera." Chelsea frowned, still not understanding why everyone was acting like her name recognition should mean something significant to her, Why the fact that this passenger had given his name should change anything about the situation or about the actions she had taken to resolve what she still believed was a legitimate security concern. "I know he said his name was Rivera," she replied, her voice carrying a note of defensive irritation. "But he's not on the passenger manifest like I told you, and he clearly doesn't belong in first class based on his appearance and his behavior when I tried to verify his right to be sitting in that seat." "He's not on the passenger manifest." "Chelsea," Amanda shouted, completely losing her professional composure as the full scope of the disaster became clear to her, as she realized that not only had Chelsea made a terrible mistake, but that she had made it with such confidence and such absolute certainty that she had escalated it all the way to having police officers arrest an innocent passenger. "Because he's on the owner's list. The owner's list. Chelsea, do you understand what I'm telling you?" The words hung in the air like smoke from an explosion, creating a moment of absolute silence as everyone in the cabin processed what had just been revealed, as the implications of what the chief pilot had just said settled over the scene like a heavy blanket that smothered all other sounds and thoughts. Even the background noise of the aircraft systems seemed to fade away as passengers and crew members alike tried to understand what owner's list meant and why it was so important, and why Chelsea looked like all the blood had drained from her face in an instant. Lyra stopped crying for a moment, looking at the chief pilot with hope flickering in her tear-filled eyes, hope that maybe this woman could fix what was happening, could make these police officers take the handcuffs off her daddy and apologize for scaring them both, and let them finally go home like they were supposed to do. "Damon Rivera is the CEO of TechFlow Industries," Amanda continued, her hands shaking visibly as she held up the tablet with its urgent notifications and legal documents and all the proof that would be needed to demonstrate just how catastrophically wrong Chelsea had been in her assumptions, just how terrible a mistake she had made when she decided to call security on a sleeping passenger based on nothing more than his choice of clothing and the color of his skin. TechFlow Industries is the private equity firm that finalized the purchase of Meridian Airways at 9 o'clock this morning London time, which was about 14 hours ago if you're keeping track. She continued, her voice shaking with the effort of maintaining any semblance of professional composure, when what she really wanted to do was scream at Chelsea for being so unbelievably stupid and short-sighted and prejudiced that she had created a situation that might very well destroy careers and reputations, and possibly even the airline itself. The paperwork was just filed with the Federal Aviation Administration about 90 minutes ago, and the ownership transfer is completely official and legally binding. Amanda went on each word, landing like a hammer blow in the silent cabin. The board of directors sent out notifications to all senior staff exactly 30 minutes ago, which is why I have it on my tablet, and why I came running down here the moment I realized what was happening, the moment I understood that one of our flight attendants was in the process of having our new owner arrested and removed from his own aircraft. She took a step toward Damon, whose hands were still cuffed behind his back, while Officer Thompson continued to hold his arm, even though the officer's grip had loosened considerably as he began to realize that something was very wrong with this situation, that perhaps the passenger he had been preparing to arrest wasn't actually a trespasser at all, but someone very different from what he had been led to believe. Amanda's voice dropped to a whisper that somehow carried more weight than if she had been shouting at the top of her lungs, a quiet intensity that made everyone in the cabin lean forward slightly to make sure they didn't miss a single word of what she was about to say. "He owns this airline, Chelsea," she said, her words precise and devastating in their simplicity. "He owns this aircraft that we're all standing on right now. He owns the fuel in the tanks that will power our flight to Chicago. He owns the seat that you just had him arrested for occupying, the seat that he paid for with his own credit card, using his own money to buy a ticket on his own airline. And he owns the company that signs your paycheck every 2 weeks, the company that has employed you for 17 years and that you have just humiliated in the most public and catastrophic way imaginable." The color drained from Chelsea Bradford's face so quickly that she looked like a wax figure melting in real time, her carefully applied makeup suddenly standing out in stark contrast against skin that had gone completely pale, almost gray, as the full implications of what she had done began to sink into her consciousness, and she started to understand that her career wasn't just in trouble, but was probably over, finished, done ending right here in this cabin, in front of all these witnesses who would remember this moment for the rest of their lives. Jonathan Park, who had been recording everything on his phone from the moment the police officers arrived, whispered, "Oh my God," under his breath with a mixture of amazement and horror, and immediately started uploading the video to his social media accounts where he knew his 4 million followers across various platforms were about to witness something absolutely unprecedented. Something that would probably break the internet and trend worldwide within the next hour as the video spread from his accounts to news outlets to every corner of social media where people shared stories of injustice and dramatic reversals of fortune. Senator Margaret Wellington, who had been waiting in the jet bridge to board, and who had been quietly supportive of Chelsea's actions when the flight attendant had explained that she was dealing with a security situation that needed to be resolved before premium passengers could board, suddenly found the aircraft floor incredibly interesting to look at. Her political instincts immediately, recognizing that she was on the wrong side of a situation that was about to become very public and very damaging to anyone who was associated with it. Anyone who had supported or endorsed the treatment of a black CEO who had just been arrested for the crime of trying to sleep in a first-class seat on his own airline. Damon Rivera, still handcuffed and still flanked by 2 police officers who were beginning to realize that they had made a serious mistake in accepting Chelsea's characterization of the situation without doing any independent verification of the facts, turned slowly to face Chelsea Bradford, with an expression that was calm and measured, and absolutely terrifying in its controlled intensity, the look of someone who possessed real power and was deciding exactly how to use it, exactly what consequences would be appropriate for what had just happened to him and to his daughter. This wasn't the look of someone who was angry or vindictive or interested in revenge for its own sake. It was the expression of someone who understood that actions had consequences, and that those consequences needed to be meaningful enough to ensure that this kind of thing didn't happen again to the next black man who made the mistake of trying to sleep in first class while wearing casual clothes, the next parent who had to watch their child cry because flight attendants and police officers couldn't see past their own biases and assumptions. Lyra, her small face still wet with tears, but her crying subsided into occasional hiccuping sobs, ran to her father and wrapped her arms around his legs, despite the awkwardness of the handcuffs that prevented him from hugging her back. Her small voice muffled against his jeans as she said the words that cut through all the adult complexity and got right to the heart of what mattered most in this situation. "I told you he bought the tickets," she said, her voice triumphant, despite still shaking with the aftermath of fear and confusion. "I told you I watched him do it. Why didn't you just check like Daddy asked you to?" "Chief Pilot Rodriguez," Damon said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who was accustomed to boardrooms and billion-dollar decisions. Someone whose words carried weight because of the resources and influence behind them. Someone who didn't need to raise his voice or make threats because everyone in the room understood that he had the power to make things happen with just a phone call or an email to the right people. "Could you please ask Officer Thompson to remove these handcuffs? It's rather difficult to comfort my daughter or to have the necessary conversations about what happens next while wearing restraints that were put on me because I committed the apparently serious crime of trying to sleep in a seat that I own on an aircraft that I own." The click of the handcuffs being unlocked sounded like a gunshot in the absolutely silent cabin, a sharp metallic sound that seemed to announce that the real power dynamic in this situation had just been revealed and understood by everyone present, that everything that had happened up to this point was about to be reversed, and that the people who had wielded authority so confidently just moments ago were now the ones who needed to worry about consequences and repercussions. Officer Thompson, suddenly realizing that he had just manhandled and handcuffed a billionaire who owned the airline they were standing on, backed away slowly with his face flushing a deep, embarrassed red that spread from his collar to his hairline, mumbling an apology that nobody really heard because everyone's attention was focused on what was happening between Damon and Chelsea, on what consequences would flow from this catastrophic mistake that had been made through prejudice and assumption rather than through any actual security concern. Officer Martinez was already on her radio calling in to report the situation to her supervisor and requesting guidance on how to handle what was clearly going to require significant paperwork and probably several internal investigations into how they had ended up arresting an airline owner based on a flight attendant's unfounded complaints about a passenger who had done nothing wrong. Damon rubbed his wrists where the metal restraints had dug into his skin hard enough to leave red marks that would probably turn into bruises over the next few hours, taking his time and allowing the silence to stretch out until it became uncomfortable for everyone who was watching, until people started shifting in their seats and avoiding eye contact because the weight of what had happened was becoming impossible to ignore or minimize. He didn't look at the officers who had arrested him, didn't waste his attention on people who had simply been doing their jobs based on false information that had been provided to them by someone who should have known better. He didn't look at Chief Pilot Rodriguez, who was sweating through her uniform despite the aircraft's climate control, and who clearly understood that her own job was probably hanging by a thread depending on how this situation was ultimately resolved and who took responsibility for what had happened. And he didn't look at the passengers who were still recording everything from multiple angles, creating a permanent digital record of this moment that would live on the internet forever and would be replayed and analyzed and discussed in countless forums and comment sections and news programs. Instead, he looked directly at Chelsea Bradford, whose carefully constructed world was collapsing in real time as she began to understand that her 17 years of authority and her sense of control over first-class cabins meant absolutely nothing when confronted with someone who actually owned the entire operation, someone who had the power to end careers with a word and to reshape the entire company according to his vision of what it should be. Sir Chief Pilot Rodriguez stammered, stepping forward with the kind of desperate urgency that comes from recognizing that your career might be ending along with everyone else's, that your attempts to maintain professional composure are futile in the face of a disaster of this magnitude. On behalf of Meridian Airways, on behalf of everyone who works for this company, I am profoundly sorry for what has happened here tonight. There was obviously a catastrophic communication error in our systems, and the new ownership information hasn't been fully integrated into our passenger databases yet, which is why your name didn't show up when Chelsea checked the manifest, assuming she actually checked it at all, rather than just making assumptions based on your appearance. This is an absolute catastrophe, and I want you to know that we will be conducting a full investigation into how this happened and implementing new procedures to ensure that nothing like this ever happens again to anyone, regardless of whether they own the airline or whether they're just a regular passenger who deserves to be treated with dignity and respect. It's not a communication error. Amanda Damon said, his voice level but carrying a weight that made everyone in the cabin hold their breath and lean forward slightly to make sure they heard every word he was about to say, every syllable that would help them understand what he was thinking and what consequences were about to flow from this situation. This is a culture error, and culture errors are much more serious than technical glitches or database problems, because they reveal problems that go far deeper than computer systems or integration timelines. They reveal assumptions and biases and patterns of behavior that have been allowed to persist for years or maybe decades without anyone seriously questioning whether they were appropriate or fair or consistent with the values that a company claims to hold. He reached into the pocket of his hoodie with a movement that made Officer Thompson flinch instinctively, before catching himself and forcing his body to remain still, and pulled out his smartphone with its sleek black case and the kind of advanced technology that cost more than most people made in a month. The kind of device that executives and technologists used to stay connected to their businesses and their lives. No matter where they were or what time zone they happened to be in, the screen showed a voice recording application that was still running, still active, still capturing every word that was being spoken in the cabin, and creating a permanent audio record that could never be disputed or explained away or dismissed as someone's biased recollection of events. The red recording button was still engaged, still documenting everything, still preserving the truth of what had happened in a format that couldn't be altered or denied. "Ms. Bradford," Damon said, and Chelsea flinched as if he had struck her, her body reacting involuntarily to the sound of her name being spoken by someone who now held complete power over her professional future, and probably her personal life as well. Someone who could end her career with a word, and who had every reason to be angry about what she had done to him and to his daughter. "Sir, if I had known who you were," she began, her voice trailing off as she realized that anything she said was being recorded and could be used against her in ways that she couldn't even begin to imagine, that there was no explanation or apology that could possibly make this situation better or undo what had already been done. "Stop!" Damon cut her off, not raising his voice, but somehow managing to fill the cabin with the kind of authority that made everyone freeze in place, that commanded attention and respect without needing volume or threats to achieve its effect. "If you had known I was the owner, you would have treated me with respect and courtesy and professional hospitality. That's exactly the problem with your attitude and your behavior tonight. The thing that makes this a culture error rather than just a simple mistake that could be corrected with better training or clearer procedures." Lyra, still holding her father's hand with a grip that suggested she wasn't planning to let go anytime soon, looked up at Chelsea with the kind of direct, unfiltered curiosity that only children possess the ability to ask questions that adults know better than to voice out loud, because they expose uncomfortable truths that everyone would prefer to leave buried beneath layers of politeness and social convention. "Why didn't you just check the computer like Daddy asked?" she said, her small voice somehow cutting through all the complexity and adult rationalizations to get at the simple truth of what had happened. The basic fact that none of this would have occurred if Chelsea had simply done what Damon had suggested from the very beginning and verified his information through the airline systems before calling security and having him arrested. It was such a simple question, so obviously the right thing that should have been done, and yet it highlighted just how fundamentally wrong Chelsea's approach had been from the start, how her assumptions and biases had prevented her from taking the most basic step that would have immediately resolved the situation without trauma or handcuffs or crying children or viral videos that would haunt everyone involved for years to come. Chelsea had no answer for the child's question, no explanation that would make sense to a 9-year-old who couldn't understand why grown-ups would make things so complicated when the solution was so simple and obvious, why they would choose assumption over verification and confrontation over courtesy. Tears began to well in Chelsea's eyes, though they seemed to come more from shock and fear about what was about to happen to her than from any genuine remorse for the pain and humiliation she had inflicted on Damon and his daughter. Damon walked closer to Chelsea, closing the distance between them with slow, deliberate steps that made her seem to shrink visually with each movement he made, as if his physical presence was somehow reducing her in size and importance and authority, until she was no longer the powerful head purser who controlled the first-class cabin, but just someone who had made a terrible mistake and was about to pay the price for it. "You said I was being aggressive," he stated, his voice carrying the kind of calm certainty that comes from having recorded evidence to back up every claim, from knowing that there was no way for anyone to dispute what actually happened because it was all captured on audio that could be played back and analyzed and shared with anyone who needed to hear it. "You told your colleague that I had threatened you, that I had used profanity and made statements that could be interpreted as threats against crew members and passengers. You lied to federal police officers about a paying passenger's behavior because you didn't like the way I was dressed because I didn't match your mental image of what someone in first class should look like. He held up his phone so that everyone could see the voice memo application clearly displayed on the screen, the waveform still moving as it captured every word being spoken in the cabin, creating a visual representation of the permanent record that was being made of this entire encounter. "There are multiple cameras in this cabin, Ms. Bradford." He continued, pointing to the small black domes mounted in the ceiling that recorded everything that happened in first class for security and liability purposes. Cameras that would show exactly what had occurred and would prove beyond any doubt that Chelsea's claims about his behavior had been complete fabrications. And as I mentioned, I have a complete audio recording of our entire interaction on my phone, which is a habit I developed during hostile corporate takeover negotiations, where documentation can mean the difference between success and failure, where having an accurate record of what was actually said can protect you from people who try to claim that conversations went differently than they actually did. "I have you on record lying to police officers about my behavior," he said, each word precise and damning. "I have you on record racially profiling a passenger based on his appearance and your assumptions about who belongs in first class and who doesn't. And I have you on record abusing your authority to humiliate someone because you didn't think he looked like he belonged in the seat he had paid thousands of dollars to occupy, because his clothing choices and his skin color didn't match your narrow definition of what a first-class passenger should be." Senator Margaret Wellington cleared her throat with the kind of practiced political timing that comes from decades of trying to control conversations and manage situations that are spiraling out of control, attempting to insert herself into this situation in a way that might allow her to minimize her own association with what had happened and protect her reputation from the fallout that was sure to come. "Mr. Rivera, if I may," she said, her voice carrying the authority that comes from holding elected office and from being accustomed to having people listen when she spoke. "Perhaps we could discuss this situation privately rather than in front of other passengers who don't need to be involved in what is clearly a personnel matter that should be handled through proper channels. Delaying the flight any further seems counterproductive for everyone involved, and I'm sure we can find a resolution that satisfies all parties if we just move this conversation to a more appropriate setting." Damon turned his gaze to the senator with the kind of measured assessment that politicians usually reserved for each other during campaign season. The look of someone who understood exactly what game was being played and who wasn't interested in participating in the usual political dance of minimizing controversy and protecting powerful people from the consequences of their actions or their associations. "Senator Wellington," he said, his voice carrying just enough warmth to be polite, but not enough to suggest friendship or any particular desire to accommodate her request. "It's good to see you again, though. I wish it were under better circumstances. I believe your campaign accepted a rather substantial donation from my Political Action Committee during your last election cycle, didn't it? Something in the neighborhood of $500,000, if I'm remembering correctly, which helped fund those very effective television advertisements about education reform and job creation that probably made the difference in several key districts." The senator stiffened visibly as she realized that she was on the wrong side of this confrontation, that her attempt to minimize the situation and move it out of public view had just reminded everyone present that she had financial connections to the person she was trying to convince to handle things. Quietly, connections that would make it very difficult for her to distance herself from this incident if it became the kind of scandal that she feared it might become. Her political instincts, honed by years of navigating complex situations and managing her public image, were telling her to distance herself from Chelsea as quickly and completely as possible to make it clear that she had no involvement in what had happened, and that she certainly didn't endorse the treatment that Damon and his daughter had received. Lyra tugged on her father's sleeve, looking up at him with an expression that was wise beyond her years, with the kind of serious concern that children sometimes show when they understand that something important is happening but aren't quite sure what all of it means, or what the right thing to do might be in a situation this complicated. "Daddy, what's going to happen to her?" she asked, gesturing toward Chelsea with her stuffed elephant. "Is she going to lose her job? What will happen to her family if she doesn't have any money?" It was a question that cut right to the heart of the moral complexity of this situation, that acknowledged that while justice needed to be served and consequences needed to be meaningful, there were also human costs to those consequences that shouldn't be ignored or dismissed as irrelevant just because someone had made a terrible mistake driven by bias and poor judgment. "This flight is being delayed," Damon announced to the entire cabin, his voice carrying easily to the economy section, where passengers were still recording everything on their phones and live streaming to social media accounts that were spreading the news of what was happening in real time across the internet. "We need to change crew members before departure, because I will not allow this aircraft to leave the gate with someone in a position of authority who has demonstrated such poor judgment and such fundamental disregard for basic human dignity that she would rather call police and have an innocent passenger arrested than take 30 seconds to verify information through official channels." He turned back to face Chelsea directly, his expression calm but implacable, showing none of the anger or vindictiveness that she might have expected from someone who had just been handcuffed and arrested on his own aircraft, but instead displaying the kind of controlled determination that comes from someone who understands that consequences need to be meaningful and that letting this slide would send exactly the wrong message to everyone watching. "You have 30 seconds, he said, simply, his words carrying the weight of finality that comes from someone who has made billion-dollar decisions and who understands that sometimes the hardest thing to do is also the right thing to do. "Excuse me, Chelsea," whispered her voice barely audible as she struggled to process what was happening to her career and her life as the reality of her situation began to sink in through the shock and the fear and the desperate hope that maybe this was all just a nightmare that she would wake up from and laugh about later. "You have 30 seconds to gather your personal belongings from the galley and leave this aircraft." Damon said his words precise and final, leaving no room for negotiation or appeal or any suggestion that there might be some way to fix this situation or to convince him to show mercy. "You are no longer an employee of Meridian Airways, and your termination is effective immediately as of this moment. Your final paycheck will be mailed to you along with information about Cobra health insurance continuation and any other benefits you're entitled to under your employment contract." You can't just fire me like this." Chelsea gasped, the tears that had been threatening finally beginning to spill over and run down her cheeks, leaving tracks through her carefully applied makeup and making her look suddenly older and more vulnerable than she had appeared just minutes ago when she was wielding her authority with such confidence. "I have union representation. I have seniority rights. I have 17 years of service with this company, 17 years of dedication and excellent performance reviews and commendations from supervisors and compliments from passengers. That should count for something that should protect me from being fired without due process or a proper investigation." "You had 17 years of service," Damon corrected his voice, carrying the kind of finality that comes from someone who has made decisions involving billions of dollars and thousands of employees. Someone who understands that sometimes the most important thing you can do is to act decisively and clearly when faced with behavior that cannot be tolerated. And you just spent all of that accumulated goodwill and all of that seniority trying to have a paying passenger arrested because you didn't like his clothing choices, because he didn't match your narrow and prejudiced definition of who belongs in first class and who should be relegated to economy or removed from the aircraft entirely. He checked his watch, a simple digital display that probably cost less than Chelsea's designer shoes, but somehow carried more authority than any luxury timepiece could have managed. The gesture making it clear that he was serious about the 30-second deadline and that she needed to make a decision about whether she was going to comply voluntarily or whether he was going to have the police officers who had arrested him just minutes ago escort her off the aircraft in exactly the same manner that she had planned for him. "As for the union, I reviewed your collective bargaining agreement during the due diligence phase of our acquisition, because I always make sure I understand the employment contracts and labor agreements that govern the companies I purchase. He continued, his voice taking on the kind of clinical precision that comes from discussing legal documents and contractual obligations, rather than human lives and careers. Section 14, subsection B, clearly states that gross misconduct involving falsification of security threats against passengers constitutes grounds for immediate termination without arbitration or appeal process, specifically because such behavior represents such a serious breach of passenger trust and safety that allowing the employee to remain on duty, even for the duration of an investigation, would pose unacceptable risks. 20 seconds, he added, his voice as calm and measured as if he were discussing the weather, rather than ending someone's career in the most public and humiliating way possible. The silence in the cabin was absolute, broken only by the quiet hum of the aircraft's environmental systems and the barely audible sound of passengers shifting in their seats as they witnessed something that none of them would ever forget. Something that would probably be referenced in business school case studies and diversity training programs and discussions about power and privilege and the consequences of prejudice for years to come. Jasmine Chen was trembling visibly, tears streaming down her face as she realized that her supervisor's career was ending in real time, and that her own job security was probably hanging by a thread, depending on how much responsibility was assigned to her for making the call to the flight deck that had brought security to the aircraft in the first place. Senator Wellington was studying her manicured fingernails with the kind of intense concentration that suggested she was trying to become invisible, trying to mentally remove herself from this situation so that when the videos went viral and the news coverage began and the questions started being asked about who had supported or endorsed this treatment of a black CEO, her name wouldn't be mentioned, or her association with the incident wouldn't be remembered. The passengers that Chelsea had tried so hard to impress with her professionalism and her attention to detail were either recording her downfall for posterity, ensuring that there would be a permanent digital record of this moment that would live on the internet forever, or looking away in embarrassment at what they were witnessing, uncomfortable with being spectators to someone's complete professional destruction, even if that person had brought it on themselves through their own actions. Jonathan Park was providing live commentary to his followers as he streamed everything in real time, his voice barely above a whisper, but still clearly audible to anyone who was paying attention as he narrated the unprecedented events unfolding before him. "This is the most insane thing I have ever witnessed in my entire life," he said, his words carrying a mixture of amazement and disbelief and the kind of fascinated horror that comes from watching something terrible happen in real time. "The flight attendant just got fired by the passenger she tried to have arrested, and it turns out he literally owns the airline that employs her. You cannot make this stuff up. This is going to break the internet in about 10 minutes. 10 seconds, Damon said, his voice cutting through the silence like a knife through fabric. Lyra whispered to her father, her small voice barely audible but carrying clearly in the quiet cabin. "Is she going to be okay, Daddy? What if she has kids? What if they don't have any money now?" Damon's jaw tightened with emotion as he looked down at his daughter, and for a moment his expression softened in a way that suggested he was struggling with the same question, that he understood the human cost of the decision he was making, even as he remained convinced that it was the right decision. The necessary decision, the only decision that would send a clear message about what kind of behavior would and would not be tolerated on his airline. Chelsea looked around the cabin desperately, her eyes moving from face to face as she searched for allies or support or someone who might be willing to intervene on her behalf, to speak up and suggest that maybe immediate termination was too harsh a consequence, and that there should be some kind of investigation or review process before such a drastic step was taken. She looked for sympathy from the passengers she had tried to protect, understanding from the crew members she had worked with for years, or mercy from the police officers who had been prepared to arrest an innocent man based on her lies and her biases. She found none of these things. Every eye in the cabin was either recording her humiliation for social media, creating a permanent record that would follow her for the rest of her life, and would probably make it impossible for her to find another job in the aviation industry, or looking away in the kind of embarrassment that people feel when they witness someone's complete professional destruction and don't want to be associated with it or remembered as having been present when it happened. The passengers she had tried to impress with her dedication to standards and her commitment to maintaining the first-class experience were now seeing her for what she really was, and the crew members she had outranked and bossed around for years were too terrified of their own job security to offer any support or to risk being associated with someone who had just been fired for cause by the new owner of the airline. "If you're not off this aircraft in 5 seconds," Damon continued, his voice never rising above conversational level but somehow carrying more threat than if he had been shouting at the top of his lungs, "I will have Officer Thompson escort you off for trespassing on an aircraft that you no longer have any authorization to be on. And unlike my experience with handcuffs earlier this evening, I guarantee he won't be particularly gentle about the process of removing you from my property." The irony hit Chelsea like a physical blow to the stomach. The realization that the very threat she had used against Damon was now being turned back against her. With interest that the same police officers she had summoned to remove him from first class were now being positioned to remove her from the aircraft. She had considered her domain for the past 17 years, the space where she had exercised authority and maintained standards, and built a career that was now ending in the most humiliating way she could possibly have imagined. Chelsea Bradford, who had ruled first-class cabins with absolute authority for nearly 2 decades, who had been praised and promoted and held up as an example of excellence in customer service, let out a sound that was part sob and part gasp of disbelief, a noise that captured the complete collapse of everything she thought she knew about her place in the world and her value as a professional, and her future prospects in an industry that was probably going to blacklist her after this incident became public knowledge. She stumbled toward the crew storage area with trembling hands, grabbing her purse and winter coat, while trying to process the fact that her career was ending right now, in this moment in front of all these witnesses who would remember this, and would probably share their stories of what they saw for years to come whenever the topic of workplace injustice or consequences of prejudice came up in conversation. As she passed Damon on her way to the aircraft door, moving like someone in a daze, he spoke one final time, his voice quiet but carrying clearly in the silent cabin. "Leave the scarf." Chelsea froze in place, her hand instinctively moving to the silk accessory that had been part of her uniform for 17 years, the symbol of her authority and professional identity, the small piece of fabric that had marked her as someone important in the hierarchy of commercial aviation, someone whose opinion mattered and whose authority was recognized by everyone who saw the scarf and understood what it meant. That scarf is part of the Meridian Airways uniform. Damon explained, his voice carrying the patient tone that teachers use when explaining something obvious to students who should already understand it, but somehow don't. That logo represents a brand that was built on hospitality and service and treating every passenger with dignity and respect, values that you clearly don't share and that you have actively violated through your actions tonight. You don't represent that brand anymore, so you don't get to wear its symbols or claim any association with the standards that the rest of us are going to work very hard to uphold from this moment forward. With trembling fingers that could barely manage the simple task, Chelsea untied the silk scarf that had been the symbol of her authority and professional identity for 17 years. The piece of fabric that had distinguished her from junior flight attendants and had marked her as someone who had earned seniority and respect through years of service that apparently meant nothing in the face of the catastrophic mistake she had made tonight. The scarf slipped from Chelsea's shaking hands and landed on the beverage cart with a soft whisper of expensive silk against stainless steel, then slid off to fall onto the cabin floor where it lay like a small patch of navy blue against the neutral gray carpet. Such a small thing, just a piece of fabric with a corporate logo embroidered in gold thread. But somehow it represented the complete transfer of power that had just taken place in this first-class cabin and the end of one person's career and authority. Chelsea walked toward the aircraft door on unsteady legs that barely seemed capable of supporting her weight, not looking at anyone and unable to speak because there were no words that could adequately express what she was feeling, or that could change what had happened, or undo the consequences that were now inevitable and permanent. She disappeared into the cold jet bridge that led back to the terminal and an uncertain future that no longer included the job that had defined her identity for the better part of 2 decades, that had given structure and meaning to her life, and had provided her with a sense of purpose and accomplishment that was now gone forever. The sound of her footsteps faded quickly, replaced by a silence that seemed to stretch on forever as everyone in the cabin tried to process what they had just witnessed and what it meant for them and for the airline and for the broader questions about justice and prejudice and the consequences of making assumptions about people based on their appearance. Damon turned his attention to Jasmine Chen, who looked like she was about to faint from fear and shock. Her face pale and her hands shaking as she tried to process everything that had just happened and figure out whether her own job was about to disappear along with her supervisors, whether she was going to be held responsible for making the call to the flight deck that had brought security to the aircraft and had set in motion all the terrible events that followed. "What's your name?" Damon asked, his voice gentle and warm for the first time since this entire confrontation had begun. The sharp edge of authority replaced by something that sounded almost paternal in its kindness, suggesting that he understood she was frightened and that he wasn't planning to punish her for being caught in the middle of a situation that she hadn't created and hadn't wanted any part of. "Jasmine," she managed to squeak out through the tears that were still streaming down her face, her voice barely audible as she struggled to control her emotions enough to speak coherently. "Jasmine Chen, sir. I'm so sorry about what happened. I tried to tell her that maybe you had used miles to upgrade that. Maybe she should check the system before calling security. But she outranks me and I didn't know how to—" Jasmine Damon said, his voice softening even further as he smiled at her, with the kind of genuine warmth that transformed his entire appearance, that made him look less like a powerful CEO who had just fired someone, and more like a kind person who understood that she had been put in an impossible position. "Did you want to call security on me tonight? Did you think I was a threat that needed to be removed from this aircraft?" "No, sir." Jasmine cried, her words rushing out in a torrent as she tried to explain her position and defend her actions, to make him understand that she hadn't agreed with what Chelsea was doing, but hadn't known how to stop it without risking her own career. "I told Ms. Bradford that you might have used frequent flyer miles to upgrade your seat, or that maybe you were one of those tech executives who dress casually but have plenty of money. I suggested that she should double-check the passenger manifest before taking any action, and I tried to tell her that something felt wrong about the whole situation, that it didn't make sense to call security on a passenger who was just sleeping peacefully in his seat." Damon nodded approvingly, his expression showing that he had heard every word of Jasmine's attempts to defend him and to question Chelsea's judgment, and that he appreciated her efforts, even though they hadn't been successful in preventing the confrontation from escalating to the point where police were called and handcuffs were applied. "I heard you trying to stand up for me," he said, his smile becoming even warmer as he acknowledged what she had tried to do despite the obvious power imbalance between her and Chelsea. "I heard you questioning her judgment and trying to suggest alternatives that might have resolved this situation peacefully without anyone being arrested or traumatized." He paused for a moment, looking around the cabin at the passengers who were still recording and at the crew members who were watching with a mixture of fascination and terror as they wondered whether they were about to witness more firings or whether the worst of the storm had passed and things were going to start getting better. "You're the new head purser for this flight, Jasmine," he announced, his words carrying clearly through the cabin and creating a ripple of surprised murmurs among the passengers and crew. "Congratulations on your promotion, which is effective immediately and which comes with an immediate salary increase and eligibility for the senior crew benefits package." What?" Jasmine stammered, her eyes widening even further as she tried to process what she was being told, as her brain struggled to shift from expecting to be fired to suddenly being promoted several levels in the span of a few seconds. "Sir, I'm not qualified for that position. I've only been flying for 9 months. I don't have the experience or the training to manage a first-class cabin on my own." "You have the only qualification that really matters," Damon replied, his voice carrying the kind of certainty that comes from someone who has made personnel decisions involving thousands of employees and billions of dollars in responsibility. Someone who understands that sometimes the most important qualities in an employee aren't the ones that show up on a resume or in a training manual. "You treated me like a human being instead of a problem to be solved. And you tried to do the right thing even when it meant questioning someone who outranked you significantly and who could have made your life very difficult for challenging her authority." Lyra tugged on her father's hand, looking up at him with a mixture of pride and relief, the tears finally drying on her cheeks as she began to understand that maybe things were going to be okay after all, that the scary part was over, and that her daddy was safe, and that they could finally go home like they were supposed to. "Can we go home now, Daddy?" she asked, her small voice carrying the kind of innocent directness that only children possess. "I'm really sleepy again, and I just want to get on the airplane and go to sleep." Damon lifted his daughter into his arms, feeling the comforting weight of her small body as she rested her head on his shoulder with her stuffed elephant tucked securely between them, the familiar pressure reminding him of what was really important in all of this, of why it mattered so much that the airline he now owned treated people with dignity and respect, regardless of what they looked like or what they were wearing. "We're going home, sweetheart," he said softly, his voice carrying all the love and protectiveness that a parent feels for their child. "We're going home right now." He looked around the cabin one more time, making eye contact with the passengers who had witnessed everything and who were still processing what they had seen, what they had learned about assumptions and prejudice and the importance of questioning authority when that authority was being exercised unjustly. "Now," he said, settling back into seat 3. A, with visible relief as Lyra curled up beside him in 3. "B, could someone please get me a ginger ale? I'm incredibly thirsty, and it's been a very, very long night." The flight finally departed 47 minutes late, with the first-class cabin quiet and subdued as everyone processed what they had witnessed and what it meant for them personally and for the broader questions about justice and fairness that the incident had raised. Jonathan Park's video was already going viral, racking up millions of views and spreading across every social media platform imaginable, with comments flooding in from people around the world who were shocked by what they were seeing and who were sharing their own stories of discrimination and bias, and the times when they had been judged unfairly based on their appearance rather than their character or their accomplishments. Jasmine Chen served drinks with trembling hands that gradually steadied as she began to accept that she really had been promoted, rather than fired, that her decision to question Chelsea's judgment and to try to stand up for what was right had resulted in advancement rather than punishment. Senator Wellington pretended to sleep for most of the flight, avoiding any conversations that might require her to explain her presence at the incident or her initial support for Chelsea's actions, recognizing that any statement she made would probably be used against her by political opponents who would be happy to accuse her of supporting discriminatory treatment of minority passengers. Other passengers whispered among themselves throughout the flight, knowing that they had witnessed something historic, something that would be talked about and analyzed and debated for years to come in discussions about corporate culture and racial profiling and the proper use of authority in service industries. Lyra fell asleep with her head on her father's shoulder, her breathing deep and even, her small hand still clutching the stuffed elephant that had been with her through all the fear and confusion of the evening, her trust in her father restored now that the scary men in uniforms had left and everything was going back to normal. Damon stroked his daughter's hair gently as the aircraft climbed to cruising altitude, leaving JFK and all its chaos behind as they headed toward Chicago and home and the opportunity to finally rest after what had been one of the longest and most difficult days of his life. The exhaustion was still there, pressing down on him like a physical weight, but there was also a sense of satisfaction that came from knowing that his daughter had seen justice served, that she had witnessed the consequences of prejudice and the importance of standing up for yourself even when it's difficult or frightening to do so. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, He knew an entire airline to transform and a culture to change, and thousands of employees who needed to understand that the old ways of doing business were no longer acceptable under the new ownership. But tonight on this flight, justice had been served in a way that was clear and unambiguous and meaningful, and his daughter had learned a powerful lesson about dignity and respect and the importance of never accepting mistreatment just because someone in authority says you have to. As Damon finally allowed his eyes to close and felt himself beginning to drift toward the sleep that his body had been craving for days, he felt a sense of peace that had nothing to do with the successful acquisition of Meridian Airways, and everything to do with the knowledge that he had used his power in a way that would create positive change for countless other passengers who would fly on this airline in the years to come. People who would never know his name, but who would benefit from the cultural transformation that had begun tonight in the first-class cabin of Flight 1847 from New York to Chicago. 6 months later, Damon settled into seat 27C in the economy section of another Meridian Airways flight, wearing the same casual clothes that had caused so much trouble that night at JFK. The same comfortable hoodie and faded jeans that had led Chelsea Bradford to make assumptions that cost her career, and that had sparked a transformation in how an entire airline thought about its passengers and its responsibilities to treat everyone with dignity. Beside him in 27D, Lyra was already absorbed in her tablet with her headphones on, completely at ease, in a way that made his heart swell with quiet satisfaction, showing none of the fear or anxiety that might have been expected from a child who had witnessed what she had witnessed 6 months ago, instead displaying the resilient confidence that comes from knowing that her father will protect her, and that the world, while sometimes unjust, can be changed for the better when good people take action. This had become his habit over the past 6 months, flying anonymously in the back of his own planes without identifying himself or claiming any special treatment, observing how passengers were treated and ensuring that the cultural changes he had implemented were actually taking hold throughout the organization, rather than just existing on paper in updated policy manuals and training materials. The flight attendant serving their section was Carlos Kim, 23 years old, and fresh from the new comprehensive training program that had been developed in direct response to that viral night. A program that emphasized treating every passenger with respect and dignity, regardless of their appearance or their seat assignment or any other characteristic that shouldn't matter when it came to basic human decency and professional service. Carlos had no idea who Damon was seeing only another passenger in jeans and sneakers who deserved the same professional courtesy and warm smile as everyone else on the aircraft, from the businessman in the expensive suit in row 25 to the college student in pajama pants in row 29, to the elderly woman traveling with her service dog in row 31. "Can I get you anything to drink?" Sir Carlos asked with genuine warmth, his smile reflecting the kind of hospitality training that focused on seeing the humanity in every passenger, rather than making judgments based on superficial characteristics or assumptions about who deserved better treatment. "Just water for both of us, thanks," Damon replied, watching as Carlos moved through the cabin with equal professionalism, treating every passenger with the same courtesy and attention regardless of what they were wearing or where they were sitting, demonstrating through his actions that the cultural change Damon had demanded was actually happening in practice and not just in the carefully worded statements that corporate communications had released to the media. After landing, Damon approached Carlos at the gate to compliment his service and to ask with genuine curiosity about the young man's experience with the training program that had become such a central part of Meridian Airways employee development. Carlos's eyes lit up when asked about the bias awareness program that had become a cornerstone of how new employees were prepared for their roles. "It was incredible, honestly," he said, with the kind of enthusiasm that suggested he genuinely meant what he was saying, rather than just providing the kind of corporate-approved response that employees sometimes give when they know they're being evaluated. They showed us videos of real situations where passengers were mistreated based on assumptions about their appearance, had us participate in role-playing exercises, where we practiced handling difficult conversations, and navigating situations where our own biases might influence our judgment. And we heard from this former flight attendant, who shared her story about making assumptions about passengers based on how they looked, and how those assumptions cost her career and taught her some really painful lessons about the harm that prejudice can cause. Damon didn't reveal that he knew exactly which former flight attendant Carlos was referring to, that Chelsea Bradford was now running that training program as part of her own journey of redemption and transformation, that she had spent the past 6 months confronting her own biases and learning how to help others recognize and overcome theirs, using her catastrophic mistake as a teaching tool that could prevent others from making similar errors in judgment that could harm passengers and destroy careers. Walking through the terminal toward his car with Lyra skipping ahead and then turning back to wait for him to catch up, Damon felt the kind of quiet satisfaction that doesn't come from stock prices or media coverage or industry recognition, but from the simple knowledge that change was happening, one flight at a time, one interaction at a time, one person choosing to see another person's humanity instead of making judgments based on superficial characteristics that had nothing to do with someone's worth or dignity or right to be treated with basic respect. His phone buzzed with a text from Jasmine Chen, who had thrived in her new role and had been promoted twice more in the past 6 months based on her outstanding performance and her natural leadership abilities. Monthly discrimination reports just came in, her message read. 0 incidents of passengers removed for appearance-related reasons across our entire fleet. The culture change is really working, Mr. Rivera. People are actually treating each other better. Damon typed back quickly, his thumbs moving across the screen as he composed a response that he hoped would encourage Jasmine to keep pushing for progress. It's working because people like you and Carlos are committed to doing better every day. Real change isn't about policies or procedures written in manuals that nobody reads. It's about people choosing to see each other's humanity and to act on that recognition in every interaction they have. Lyra skipped back to her father and slipped her small hand into his, looking up at him with an expression that was wise beyond her 9 years. "Daddy, can we get ice cream before going home?" she asked, her voice carrying the kind of hopeful tone that children use when they're pretty sure the answer is going to be yes, but want to make the request anyway. "With sprinkles," Damon asked, grinning down at his daughter with all the love that a parent feels for their child. "Obviously with sprinkles," Lyra replied, rolling her eyes with the kind of perfect 9-year-old sass that made Damon laugh out loud, the sound echoing through the parking garage as they walked toward their car. Just a father and daughter planning an ice cream outing. No cameras or viral videos or dramatic confrontations. Just the simple pleasure of being together and knowing that the world was a little bit better than it had been 6 months ago because one person had refused to accept mistreatment and had used his power to create meaningful change. The sky above Chicago was clear that evening, filled with aircraft from dozens of airlines carrying passengers of every background and appearance to destinations around the world. And while most of those flights would be routine and forgettable, every single passenger on every Meridian Airways flight would be treated with the basic dignity that should never depend on the clothes they wear or the color of their skin or any other characteristic that has nothing to do with their humanity or their right to be respected. Jonathan Park's video had reached 47 million views across various platforms and had become a case study in business schools about corporate culture and the importance of leadership in creating environments where everyone is valued, used in diversity training programs at companies worldwide, and sparking conversations in living rooms and boardrooms and classrooms about unconscious bias and the power of standing up for what's right even when it's difficult or costly to do so. But for Damon and Lyra walking through the parking garage toward their car while debating whether chocolate or vanilla ice cream was the superior choice, the viral moment was just that, a moment. What mattered infinitely more was what came after the daily choices to see people clearly and treat them fairly and build better future for everyone. Lyra looked up at her father with an expression that seemed wise beyond her years, with the kind of understanding that sometimes comes from witnessing both cruelty and justice in quick succession. "You know what, Daddy," she said thoughtfully, I think people are mostly good. They just forget sometimes. They need to be reminded. And in that simple observation from a child who had witnessed both the worst and best of humanity on an airplane 6 months ago, Damon found all the hope and validation he needed for the difficult work that still lay ahead for the ongoing effort to transform not just an airline, but the broader culture that allowed prejudice and assumption to masquerade as professional judgment, to create a world where his daughter and millions of other children would grow up in spaces where their humanity was recognized first, and their appearance was irrelevant to how they were treated by people in positions of authority and power.